So we are very excited today to have Bill Pender. He's a native of Mecklenburg County, a semi-retired attorney of Greer, Parker, Poe, and Thompson, a former naval officer who participated in the 1962 missile crisis. In 1987, he attended a U.S. Army War College at Carlisle, PA, toured Gettysburg in 1990, and with the assistance of Davidson College History Department, created the Davidson Civil War Roundtable. He's a descendant, easy for me to say, a descendant of both Union and Confederate officers who served with valor at Gettysburg. He has his undergraduate and law degree from UNC Chapel Hill. Go Tar Heels. He appeared as a defense and trial counsel before court-martials and a trained naval officer to conduct military tribunals. But one thing he did not put on his biography is he's a very talented man as an artist. And for those of you who have an interest, if you go online and look up Southern landscapes, he specializes in landscape paintings depicting the rural South, and they are beautiful. Please welcome our speaker, Bill Pender.
Thank you, B.G., and good morning, senior scholars.
Good morning.
I'm really gratified to see such a wonderful turnout in this great salon, a place of learning. And I'm also delighted to be wearing the raiment of the last speaker. And after my initial presentation, you will be given the honor to ask me questions, which I welcome. But let me field a question at all of you, which I can't answer. And that is, what was the greatest generation of Americans? I think we normally ascribe that feeling to the men who landed at Normandy and freed Europe from the yoke of Nazism. Let me just give you this as a guideline. Is it not true that every generation of Americans, and you can begin with our colonial forefathers, all in their bloody history, bequeathed a certain benefit to the succeeding generation, which sometimes we use wisely and sometimes we don't? And so I'll give you that as just food for thought that you can take home with you. I don't know who the greatest generation was. Perhaps it was all of them. Each succeeding generation has always stands on the shoulders of the preceding generation. At least that's the way I feel. I'm very thankful for our past history. And as we explore the Battle of Gettysburg and the causes and events that led up to it, think on three levels. First level is vision. Vision is an extremely important word. It directs all human endeavor. Think also in terms of strategy. How do you bring fruition to your vision? And then lastly, think of tactics. When you meet an opponent, how do you overcome that opponent? The term secession has always sort of interested me. The Civil War was not the first attempt at secession in this country. You had a secession movement in 1814 by New Englanders who were disgusted with the War of 1812. You had discussions of secession during the Mexican War, which was generally a war that was primarily fought by the South, not the North. Massachusetts did not contribute one soldier to the Mexican War. So think along those terms. And as you go back to the world of 1863, take off the 21st century lenses and try to put on the lens of the 19th century. Otherwise, you won't get it. You won't understand the causes and the results of the American Civil War. Where was what were the competing visions? Now, there were fissures on both sides. The North was not completely unified in militarily dominating the South. The South, on the other hand, was not completely solidified in fighting the war. But you can only look to two men who embodied the vision that they wanted their followership to be swayed by. And of course, one was Abraham Lincoln. What was his dominant vision? His dominant vision was the Union. Under any cost, we must preserve the Union. Jefferson Davis, on the other hand, was a secessionist. We must have independence for the South. And both men unswervingly adhered to that vision. Both men had to come up with a strategy to win or bring fruition to their vision. A secession movement can only succeed militarily. You see that in the Ukraine. In the Middle Ages, you saw it in Scotland and Ireland. You saw it all over the world. When a certain section of the country wants to depart from the mother lode. And in 1863, giving you sort of a global view, what was going on in Europe? Well, you had Bismarck, who was trying to unify Germany under the influence and guidance of Prussia, bringing together perhaps 20 individual states. In England, you had the growth of a magnificent empire. They either owned or influenced 3/4 of the world's landmass. In Italy, you had the unification of all the Italian states under Victor Emmanuel. You had these huge nation states in Europe, and they created vast armies, and they were designed to protect a mercantile interest in the form of colonies, particularly Great Britain. Now, how do you compete against the world like that? What was Lincoln's vision? Would you let a rogue republic split itself away from the country? Particularly since that rogue republic contributed about 87% of the government's revenue through the tariff. So that was one of the causes. My presentation is not to examine all the causes of the Civil War, but those were the two competing visions, and you had to have a strategy on each side for the representative of those visions to overwhelm or achieve dominance over the other. Well, let's look at the team of players who took part in the Gettysburg. All these luminaries, either they were there at Gettysburg or they had a great deal of influence in bringing about the Battle of Gettysburg. First of all, you know who these gentlemen are. Well, you can read it. Robert E. Lee and George Meade. Meade took over the Army of the Potomac, as it was called, the great nemesis of the Army of Northern Virginia under the command of Robert E. Lee, just 3 days prior to the Battle at Gettysburg. Lincoln fired Fighting Joe Hooker, who lost the Battle of Chancellorsville. Chancellorsville was a brilliant victory. It was the result of great teamwork between Lee and Stonewall Jackson, but it came at a huge cost. It was a Pyrrhic victory. The Union Army was in disarray after it, and on the side of the Confederacy, they lost Stonewall Jackson, several other generals and colonels, and the Jefferson Davis's government was extremely worried, because what did that battle gain? Practically nothing. They just defended Virginia, that's all. And just prior to that time, in December of January of 1863, they had won another great victory at Fredericksburg, which didn't really cause as much cost and loss as Chancellorsville did. But the Davis government was extremely worried because they knew they could not win just by defending Virginia. And you've heard the term that the Confederacy was on the ascent during the first 2 years of the war, and then it declined after Gettysburg. You might want to question that, because in 1863, the federal government controlled all the Barrier Islands off the coast in the southeast. They had already captured New Orleans after the Battle of Shiloh. The lower South was practically undefended, so they took New Orleans. They took all the major ports along the eastern seaboard, with the exception of Savannah and Charleston and Wilmington. That was really about all that was left. They seized Newbern, the early capital of North Carolina. And it was all due to the anaconda policy of squeezing the South, and ultimately you would achieve victory. That was a policy that a man named Winfield Scott, a Virginian who was chief of the army under Abraham Lincoln, and he convinced Lincoln that that was the way to go, and they were winning. The Davis government was worried. They knew that they couldn't possibly win unless they achieved a great victory. And it was designed to bring about the recognition of the Confederacy by Great Britain. Who's that lady? Victoria, right? She ascended to the throne of England probably in the 1830s and lived until 1901. And she did some wonderful things for Great Britain. She had a problem with respect to the American South. Who's that man? That's Prince Albert. Prince Albert, despite his appearance, he was a great liberal. He loved America. He was vehemently anti-slavery. He and Victoria together introduced reforms all over England. They softened the judicial code, which was made apparent in all the Charles Dickens novels. They introduced all kinds of welfare, created asylums for the criminally insane. They established hospitals, and they were both loved by the British people. On the other hand, who is that man? That's Lord Palmerston. Palmerston was Victoria's prime minister. He hated America, or he feared America. America was growing in strength. Our merchant marine was visible in every port in the world. We had ships there. We were exporting. This nation was operating in the black. He wanted to see the country divided. England would still be able to import its cotton and keep the mills in Birmingham and places like that running. People were getting rich. He owned probably a cotton mill, and certainly the members of the upper house of Parliament did. And they were generally pro-Southern, believe it or not. But Victoria saw Palmerston during the day. She saw Prince Albert at night. Prince Albert died, I think, in 1861. She had nowhere to turn to except Palmerston. Before the Battle of Antietam, Palmerston wanted to invade the United States at the outbreak of the Civil War. Antietam sort of moderated his views because he wasn't quite sure that the South could win. And then you had the Trent affair, where you had two Confederate commissioners. They weren't ambassadors, they were just envoys. One was James Mason from Virginia, and another man named John Slidell. Mason was going to the court of Queen Victoria. Slidell was going to France to try to talk with Napoleon III and tried to win them over to the cause of the Confederacy. There's no documentation that either of those gentlemen ever sat down with the Queen or with Napoleon III. Whether they did or not, we don't know. But in any event, this was the great gamble of the South. They had to win a huge victory, demonstrate to the British that they could win the war. Joe Hooker, meanwhile, in June of 1863, was still in command of the Army of the Potomac, the Union Army that suffered such a disastrous defeat at Chancellorsville. On June the 28th, he was fired by Abraham Lincoln. These are some of the players at Gettysburg. You had James Longstreet, Ambrose Powell Hill, and Richard Ewell, and James Ewell Brown or Jeb Stuart. After Chancellorsville, Lee and Davis realized they had to reorganize the Army because Lee had lost his senior management. He didn't know what in the world he was going to do. So prior to that time, there were two corps under Stonewall Jackson and James Longstreet. With the death of Stonewall Jackson, Lee had to create three corps, and he placed them under Longstreet, Ewell, and A.P. Hill. A.P. Hill and Ewell had never commanded a corps. They were not quite that well trained. Health entered into the picture. Ewell was an amputee, and at Gettysburg his stomach was infected. He was in great pain, which might have caused some of his tardiness in not being as aggressive as he should have been. Hill was a very capable man, but again, he had no training as a corps commander. He had fallen out previously with Andrew Jackson on many occasions. Jackson had him arrested one time for cowardice because he retreated at some battle without Jackson's permission. So A.B. Hill had his own problems, and there were other junior officers that were kicked up to greater responsibilities. One of whom, and I don't mean to talk about family, but my great-grandfather had a distant cousin, William Dorsey Pender, and when Hill was made a corps commander, Pender took over A.P. Hill's position as a division commander. You go from army to corps to division to brigade to regiment. That's the way the chain works. So this then was the plan. Lee and Davis conferred with one another right after the Battle of Chancellorsville. And Lee's plan was, well, while the Army of the Potomac is in complete disarray, this is our chance to invade Pennsylvania. And maybe we can isolate Washington. But at the same time, they realized that something was happening on the Mississippi River, and that was Vicksburg. Vicksburg at the time was under siege by U.S. Grant. Somehow he managed to interpose his army between Joe Johnson and the city of Vicksburg, commanded by Pennsylvania-born John Pemberton. Johnson did virtually nothing. He was a senior general. He could have ordered Pemberton out of Vicksburg. They could have combined their armies and defeated Grant, but that didn't happen. The Davis government knew that Vicksburg was probably going to fall, so they had a choice to make. Could we send our army down to save Vicksburg? But if we did that, then the way would be open for a Union army to advance toward Richmond. Well, after debating, they said, well, we'll just have to let Vicksburg take care of itself. We've got to go on with the plan and invade Pennsylvania. And Lee tried to do that before, you recall, at Antietam during September of 1862, which was a draw. But in any event, this was the plan. When Lee wanted to have the element of surprise, he went towards the west, toward the Blue Ridge Mountains, with an army of approximately 71,000 men. Not all at once. He left A.P. Hill back at Vicksburg to sort of stare down the Union Army, which was still in camp there. And he led the rest of his two corps under Hill and Ewell, and he went back behind the Blue Ridge Mountains. And his plan was to go up the Shenandoah Valley and break out into the Cumberland Valley of Pennsylvania. He would be shielded by the Blue Ridge Mountains and also South Mountain in Maryland. But something happened that deprived him of the element of surprise, and that was the Battle of Brandy Station. The Union Army was wondering, well, what is Lee up to? He's not the only Confederate unit is A.P. Hill. And when A.P. Hill withdrew to join Lee, Pleasanton, who was commander of the cavalry in the Army of the Potomac, decided that he would try to penetrate the cavalry screen of Jeb Stuart and go into the valley and find out where the Confederate Army was. And in doing so, they had a huge battle at Brandy Station. Jeb Stuart was caught completely unawares. He almost lost the battle, but he was finally able to fend off the Union soldiers, they were about 7,000 strong. It was a huge battle, the greatest cavalry battle in North America, and that's where the Union cavalry grew up. They found out that they were the equal of the Southern cavalry. But in doing so, they could detect that Lee was moving north. So at about that time, General Hooker thought it would be a great opportunity to invade Richmond again. And Lincoln didn't go along with that. He said, we must destroy Lee. That is the only way we're going to win this theater of the Civil War, is to destroy Lee's army. Forget about Richmond. Hooker finally agreed, but on the 28th, Lincoln fired him. The Army's choice to put in charge of the Army of the Potomac was John Reynolds, a very able soldier. But the problem with Reynolds is he was too political for Lincoln. Didn't go along with all of Lincoln's plans. So Lincoln rejected the choice of the Army and put in command George Meade, who was totally apolitical. He was just simply a child of the Army. That was his only home. And he wasn't a particularly colorful general, but he was tenacious, and he just followed the rule books, as we'll find out. So as they went forward, strange things began to unravel the overall strategy or tactical plan of Robert E. Lee. As they proceeded into Pennsylvania, he told Ewell to go ahead and proceed to Harrisburg, and if possible, capture Harrisburg, and then we will join you later with the corps of Ewell and Longstreet. Meanwhile, Longstreet was sort of toward the west, along with Ewell, and they came up by different routes, but that was the plan. And along the way, a North Carolina soldier named James Pettigrew, one of the finest sons of North Carolina, went to the University of North Carolina, a lawyer, practiced in Charleston, South Carolina, traveled Europe, spoke 2 or 3 languages. He was an extremely talented man. He was a division commander under Ewell, and Pettigrew went into the town of Gettysburg, thank you, for provisions. While he was there, he ran into a Union division under the command of John Buford. It was a cavalry division. Pettigrew saw it, went back to General Hill. Hill said, well, they're probably just Pennsylvania militia, nothing to worry about, and we still need supplies in Gettysburg. So, General Heath, you have my permission to go into Gettysburg, get rid of that nuisance Pennsylvania militia, and we'll secure provisions there, particularly shoes, which we need. Well, John Buford saved the day for the Union Army, in my opinion. He realized that the Confederates were going to enter Gettysburg in force. He sensed that he didn't know General Heath, but he realized that a whole corps of the Confederate Army was moving towards Gettysburg. Meanwhile, behind him was General Reynolds and other elements of the Army of the Potomac, and he had to buy time to give them a chance to solidify themselves and be able to develop some sort of tactical plan to defeat Robert E. Lee. So he strung out a skirmish line. These men were armed with a new Spencer repeating carbine. I could fire 7 shots. You put 7 bullets into the butt of the gun through the brass plate. And it didn't have the distance or range of the muskets of either army, the Enfield or the Springfield. But they were able to hold off the Confederate Army while General Reynolds was coming up with another corps of the Union Army, and there were several behind him. This was the first instance that Robert E. Lee knew that the Union Army had crossed the Potomac and was in his rear, and he was in disarray. He had a corps up near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. He had others scattered over in the western part, and he just sent out orders, we have to come together very quickly. And then he admonished General Heath because he started the whole affair, and Lee didn't want to fight at Gettysburg. He didn't have any maps. And the problem is he was blind. He couldn't tell exactly where he was. He didn't know the disposition of the Union Army. Why is that? Because when they first started out, he gave orders to General Stuart, stay on my right flank at all times when we march from the Shenandoah Valley through Maryland into Pennsylvania. I need to know at all times what is the deployment of the Army of the Potomac. Stuart, he was a very vainglorious kind of a fellow. At West Point, they called him Beauty. Not because he was handsome, he had a huge overbite, which he concealed with a beard. And he was a very vainglorious fellow. He was an excellent cavalryman, probably the best in the Civil War next to Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was also great. And he realized that during the 7 days around Richmond, during McClellan's ill-fated campaign to come up between the James and York River to take Richmond, Stuart rode around his entire army and brought back to the commander at the time, who was Joe Johnson, gave him full information on the deployment of the Union Army, and that led to the ultimately the Confederate victory during the what they call the Peninsula Campaign. Stuart wanted to do that again. He wanted to ride around the Union Army. And he reported back to Lee, and he said, let me reconnoiter the Union Army. Don't make me just hug your flank, but let me ride around and I can give you better information, which you're going to need. Well, the problem is the Army of the Potomac wasn't all in that disarray like they were after the Battle of Chancellorsville. Something happened to them. They had a new leadership. They were determined. They were hardened veterans, like both armies were. They were no longer amateur armies, and they wanted victory. So with uncharacteristic speed, they left Washington, and Stuart was trapped between their army and Washington, and he couldn't get around the Union Army. Now, in order for an army to march, you have to have roads, you have provision wagons, you have horse artillery, all those things that you have to hold together. Well, he couldn't advance so toward Lee at all, so he kept going north, and he ends up in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and he learns that Lee is trying to consolidate his forces around Gettysburg. Or his first order was, let's meet at Chambersburg, which is a little town to the west of Gettysburg. And so Stuart could bring him no information. Lee was absolutely blind. He had no idea what was in front of him. But he adhered to this one great military maxim: do not let the enemy build up on your front. You can't let that happen. So Lee immediately launched an attack from all units. So they were all coming from the north and northwest. And you can see day one, you can see the position of the Confederate soldiers there in red, and the blue represents the Union Army. They achieved a monumental victory on the first day. They swept through the line of General Buford, and Reynolds came up with one of his corps. Reynolds was killed by a Confederate sniper, hit him in the slug, hit him in the neck, and severed his spinal column, and he fell from the horse dead before he hit the ground. And they replaced him with a man named Abner Doubleday. So in Doubleday was immediately defeated. All Confederate units poured through the town of Gettysburg. And this was toward the evening of day one. Lee was jubilant. He thought he had a total victory close at hand. He didn't expect Meade to be there the next day. He thought Meade would be like all the other Northern generals that he had beaten. He'd go limping back to Washington, but that didn't happen. What happened was, this being day two, at the end of day one, Lee tells Ewell, look, the Union Army is going to occupy the high ground along Culp's Hill and Cemetery Ridge. I want you to take it if you deem it practicable, but do not engage in any great military engagement. Well, what kind of an order is that? One of Lee's weaknesses, as some scholars point out, was that he gave too much discretion to his subordinates. He wasn't firm enough. But Lee was used to that because he had the best that the Confederacy could give him in the Army of Northern Virginia. They all went to West Point, from corps commanders down to division commanders. He relied on the use of discretion, and you cannot macromanage over 70,000 men. You just can't do it. So you depend on your corps commanders to move forward with the overall tactical plan. Ewell took that as an opportunity to rest. His men were totally exhausted. They had fought all day long on day one. So they encamped just to the south of Gettysburg. And as they went to sleep that night, they could hear picks and shovels striking dirt and rock up on Cemetery Ridge, and the whole Union Army was digging in. Well, there's no record that Lee ever chastised Ewell for not being a little bit more aggressive. Lee, unfortunately, left no memoirs, and he never criticized his subordinates. He did criticize Jeb Stuart. They had a little one-on-one when Stuart finally arrived on the second day of the battle. And Stuart told him, well, look, I brought you some captured wagons. I have 200 Union prisoners. And Lee said, well, what good did that do us? It just slowed you down. You didn't get here soon enough, and I still don't know what's in front of me. You haven't told me. So Lee realized that on the second day he had to do something, and again, relying on the old military maxim, never, never let the enemy build up on your front. He had to keep attacking. So he ordered Ewell to resume the attack on Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill. You've got Culp's Hill, Cemetery Hill, and then you, there we go. And then at the end, you have the Cemetery Ridge and then the Round Tops at the end. That was the line of the Union Army. It sort of resembled a fish hook. You had the hook at the top and the shank, and then at the bottom, you had the two prominent hills, Little Round Top and Big Round Top. It's not too well displayed on that map. Perhaps the next one will be a little bit clearer. But in any event, at the same time that Ewell was to attack Cemetery Ridge, or Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill, Longstreet was to attack the bottom half around a place called Devil's Den, the wheat field, and the peach orchard. And why did he attack there? It's because a Union general named Dan Sickles made a huge blunder. General Hancock, who was the Union general in charge of that line, Meade had delegated that authority to him, gave Sickles specific orders to stay on the line along Cemetery Ridge. Dan Sickles got the idea that he needed to have higher ground. So he moved an entire corps away from the line and moved it to the peach orchard, and his left flank was on the wheat field and Devil's Den. Meanwhile, Longstreet was about to launch his attack, and they still didn't know where the end of the Union line was. They had gotten poor information from reconnoitering the day before. They didn't realize that it might be at Little Round Top. But at that time, Little Round Top was not occupied, but they could have taken it and gone up the ridge and probably destroyed the Union Army. But that didn't happen because they didn't realize it was unoccupied. They weren't even familiar with the Round Tops. But they saw Sickles' corps out in front, which was a great salient, and it made him vulnerable on all sides. Well, Longstreet it didn't take him long to figure out, well, this is where we're going to strike. And a Mississippi general named Lafayette McLaws, and I can't think it was, and John Bell Hood, and Longstreet immediately assailed that position of Sickles on three sides, from the north, from the west, and from the south. And they literally tore him to pieces. There was practically nothing left of Sickles' Third Corps after that segment of the battle. Meanwhile, Hancock comes down just prior to that time, and really just chastises Sickles. He says, "Why did you move your corps? We're going to be vulnerable," and the fighting was starting. And Sickles said, "Well, I just wanted higher ground." And Hancock says, "Well, you fool, if you keep marching west, you'll come to the Appalachians and you'll have high ground there. Why did you do it?" And Sickles replies, "Well, I'll come back and reform the line on Cemetery Ridge." But Hancock says, "No, stay where you are. If you try to retreat, you're going to be strung out, and that might be disastrous. You stay where you are, and I will send you support." Meanwhile, he goes back to Cemetery Ridge, and he finds a Union regiment. It was the 1st Minnesota. And he points to the Confederacy, to the Confederate line. He talks to the colonel of the Minnesota regiment. He says, "Do you see those colors?" And the colonel replies, "Yes, I do." And Hancock says, "Well, go take them." The 1st Minnesota leads a bayonet charge right into the ranks of the Confederate Army. It was suicide. Practically none of them survived. But Longstreet was totally dismayed. He said, "What in the world is behind that charge? How many men do they have up there? We have to reform our line." Well, it takes several minutes, maybe to an hour, to reform a line of that many soldiers. Meanwhile, that brought more time for the Union Army. They again were able to fortify, rectify the situation that was going on. And meanwhile, during the fighting, as they drove the Union Army away from a place called Devil's Den, they came to the full realization that there's Little Round Top. We have to get up there. We can get cannon up there and we can rake the whole Union line. At the same time, the chief engineer, a man named Governor Warren, he was the chief engineer of the Army of the Potomac. His first name is Governor, not no political distinction there. He realizes the importance of fortifying the Round Top to secure the left flank of the Union Army. He goes back to a man named Strong Vincent, who is the division commander. And he says, "You've got to send troops up there right away. The Confederate Army is going to come right up there and we will be exposed on our left flank." So Vincent sends out 3 regiments of troops. The farthest one down that would occupy Little Round Top is the name that all of you have heard of, Joshua Chamberlain, who was probably one of the greatest heroes of the Union Army. He was slated to become a minister. His father was a hero of the War of 1812. How he became a regimental commander, I don't know. I haven't researched that. But he was dedicated, committed, and a man named Colonel Oates, in charge of Alabama troops, charged that position 5 times and couldn't take it. Finally, when Chamberlain's men ran out of ammunition, they led a bayonet charge right down the slope of the mountain into the ranks of the Confederacy, brigade strength commanded by this man named Oates. They were completely off guard. They didn't expect anything like that, and Chamberlain scattered them. More troops came up there and secured that the left flank of the Union Army. Meanwhile, Longstreet went up and secured, he got to the crest of Cemetery Ridge. But again, troops came down and finally secured it, and they had to fall back. So that was one of the near misses. At the same time, Lee had ordered, as I said before, this is getting awfully complicated, I know, ordered Ewell to attack Culp's Hill. Well, Ewell didn't start his assault until around 6 o'clock in the afternoon. it was going to get dark. Longstreet didn't start his assault down at the other end of the line until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Lee had told both men, you've got to act with alacrity, you've got to be aggressive. I want you to do this early on the morning of day 2. They didn't do it. Longstreet and Lee had sort of a falling out because Longstreet wanted Lee to pull his whole army south and get behind Meade and get between Meade and Washington, which may have been a good tactical plan, but Lee wouldn't buy into that. He said, we're here. If you try to withdraw, we'll be strung out, we'll be jeopardized. That man, he always referred to the opposing Union soldier as that man, said, that man is on that hill, I will fight him here. And even when they got down to the end of the line, John Bell Hood said, well, let's not take a frontal assault against the lower part of the Union line. Let's go around. Again, Longstreet, no, that's against Lee's orders. He said, we're supposed to attack Cemetery Ridge across the Emmitsburg Road, and that's what we're going to do. Well, all of that failed. Meanwhile, up at the end of the line, Ewell didn't start his assault until 6 o'clock in the afternoon. He did very well at first. The Culp's Hill was actually two hills. He took the Union entrenchments on the lower hill, got down into the saddle area between the 2 hills, and he was going up to take the final one, and there was a great Union commander up there named George Greene. George Greene was a descendant of Nathaniel Greene, the famous Revolutionary War general from Rhode Island, who won George Washington's ultimate victory in the South. So he was repulsed because the sun went down, the men were actually shooting at each other. Greene, meanwhile, had built a log palisade up there, and he was able to hold off the Confederate assault. And then after Longstreet was repulsed, they sent more troops up there during the night. And on the last day, Culp's Hill was defended. Lee was frustrated. He didn't know what he was going to do. At first he ordered a repetition of the same thing, but he realized that his best opportunity might to make a frontal assault against the Union line, and that's what we know today as Pickett's charge. There were 3 divisions, Trimble, Pettigrew, and can't think of the other one, but anyway, that failed, and you know the rest of the story after that, and I'm sorry we've run out of time. But it was an extremely complicated battle. Nobody really knows who was in command. It sort of had a mind of its own. But both sides, I think, were valorous. And following that, in August, Lee tendered his resignation to Jefferson Davis. Davis refused it. The war would go on for nearly 2 more years. The Confederate government considered Gettysburg just a setback. We'll ultimately win. Meanwhile, Vicksburg fell on July the 4th. Well, things were pretty gloomy for the South then. They couldn't win, particularly when you had the advent of Sherman carving up Georgia and Lincoln's re-election in 1864 and opposing him, a man running on the peace ticket, George McClellan, a general that could be fired earlier. So that's how the country was brought together. And so I'll repeat the same question to you. What was America's greatest generation? And I appreciate the honor to be here. I hope you become radicalized in the love of American history and your Judaic Christian heritage. And with that, I'll close and be happy to respond to any questions.
Bill is going to stay for a half hour after. I've got a couple of closing comments, so those of you that are rushing to the door, we're going to have it locked. All right, thank you. We'll do this.
Okay.